Okay, I believe we're about ready to get started. Welcome back. Good evening. I'm Alan Stone, and I'm going to be the moderator for this panel, which is specifically called Oswald in Mexico City. And of all the puzzles surrounding the murder of JFK, hardly any are any more mysterious than Lee Oswald's alleged September-October trip to Mexico City in the early fall of 1963. Our format for this panel is going to be a little bit different than the panels earlier in the day. This will be a 2.5-hour session with no break, and we're also not going to have any long presentations by each of the panel members to get started. I will make the presentation, and then I will just get them involved. We do have a distinguished panel to help us sort out Lee Oswald's trip to Mexico City, and we'll begin here at the far right and welcome back for his second straight panel duty, Colonel Ole Nechepurenko, retired from the KGB. I don't know what was said in the way of introducing him before the afternoon panel, so I, at the risk of maybe repeating some things that were said, want to tell you a little bit about his background. He was born on the 4th of July in 1932 in Moscow, studied from 1953 to 1957 in the translation faculty at the Moscow Teacher Training Institute. In 1958, he began to serve in the KGB as a counterintelligence officer for the Moscow Regional Directorate. In 1960, he was moved to the first Chief Directorate of Foreign Intelligence of the KGB. From 61 until 65, he stayed in the KGB Residentura in Mexico City under diplomatic cover of the Soviet Embassy Consular Section. He was responsible for counterintelligence and embassy security. His second mission in Mexico City was from 1967 to 71, when he was accused of plotting to destroy the Mexican government, declared persona non grata, and expelled. The last 2 years of his life has been devoted to writing the book Passport to Assassination, which is available over in the Ask Mart. Would you please welcome Colonel Ole Nechepurenko. Do we need to introduce Mary Farrell? Is there anyone here who does not know Mary Farrell? And to my left is Robert Dorf, a veteran researcher and investigator, the author of the screenplay The Last Investigation. And rounding out this august body is Gaten Fonzie, author of Annenberg, Biography of Power. Fonzie investigated the role of exiled Cubans in the JFK case for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. Gaten Fonzie.
And Mr. Fonzie is also the author of the book, The Last Investigation.
You just beat me to that. She just told me that. Okay. As I mentioned, the subject of Oswald in Mexico City is rife with information, much of which is quite possibly disinformation. The recently released House Assassination Committee's Mexico City report intensifies interest in the mystery, and on page 179 of that report, the mystery man photograph, also known as CE-237, is identified as Soviet KGB officer Yuri Ivanovich Moskalev. This is the person whom the CIA first misidentified as Oswald, allegedly departing from the Soviet embassy in Mexico City on October 1st, 1963. As of the moment, our search for Moskalev has been fruitless. In a telephone conversation earlier this month, KGB officer Valery Kostakov, who headed the Mexico City activities of that agency in 1963, categorically rejected the identification of Moskalev. There was, he said, no connection between the KGB's Mexico City activities and the man pictured in the photograph or any person named Yuri Moskalev. Now, Colonel Ole Nechepurenko worked under Kostakov at the embassy. He has got some thoughts on this subject in his book, Passport to Assassination, but instead of me reading that quote, Colonel Nechepurenko, let me just ask you, if you could, to identify the man in CE-237.
Указан на фотографии, насколько я вспоминаю, это бывший военнослужащий. Человек, который присутствует на фотографиях, представленных ЦРУ комиссии Уоррена, якобы как Освальд, насколько я могу припомнить, посещал наше посольство несколько раз и как я припоминаю, это бывший военнослужащий американский, который имел какие-то психиатрические проблемы и был уволен из армии. Точно сейчас скажу, зачем он к нам обращался, я не помню. Но вот такую информацию об этом человеке она мне была.
As far as I know, the man in the picture identified by Americans as Mr. Moskalev, he really visited Soviet embassy in Mexico City, but as far as I remember, he was a demobilized GI and he had some psychological problems and
Was demobilized.
yeah, he was demobilized soldier of American army.
Who did visit the
Обращался
Soviet embassy.
он в посольство, я не помню зачем, но вел себя
Yeah.
очень спокойно.
I don't remember why he appeared at the Soviet embassy, but he was pretty calm, and I just don't remember why he came.
Что касается Юрия Ивановича Москалева, то такого человека в посольстве не было никогда. Во всяком случае, в тот период, который обсуждается. И ни в КГБ, ни среди дипломатов, ни среди сотрудников групп GRU.
As I know, there is no such a person as Mr. Moskalev. He never existed, and I just don't know such a person.
Anyone else want to get it? Sure, Mary.
Oh, there may be a few here who do not know the history of this unidentified man we call CE 237. This was the commission exhibit in volume 16 of the Warren Commission exhibits. We would never have had this picture or any of these pictures had not Mexico City on the November 22nd, 1963 sent three poses or three photographs of a man. They said, this is Lee Harvey Oswald, and they sent them to Dallas. One we're familiar with as CE 237. It was a number of years before we got the other two. We now have about 15. But that afternoon, they sent them, and on Saturday night, an FBI man, Bardwell Odom, cropped that picture. He cropped it in a square like, and he took it out to the Inn of Six Flags where Marguerite and Marina were in protective custody. And Mr. Odom handed this picture in to Marguerite and said, do you know this man? She said, no, I've never seen him. They showed the picture to Marina, and she said, no, I've never seen him. Well, that would have been the end of it, except the next day, Marguerite sees the picture of Jack Ruby on television, the man who had killed her son. And Marguerite screamed to the world. They knew he was going to kill my son because they showed me his picture last night. Well, there was a slight resemblance. This started a battle between the Warren Commission a month later and the CIA, because the CIA did not want that picture published. Mr. Helms wrote a memo in August saying this is going to involve an innocent person, possibly having nothing to do with the assassination. In 1972, Bud Fensterwald, 73, July of 73, Bud Fensterwald in Washington, an attorney, obtained two more pictures. These were made with the white shirt and khaki trousers. The one we see twice in the volumes. We see it pictured as CE 237. We see it again as the Odom exhibit. It's cropped differently. We have just recently received the uncropped version of these pictures, a number of them. And Colonel Oleg Necheparenko has been kind enough to draw us a diagram and show us exactly where the pictures were taken and what the man was doing, and he was passing. You go ahead and tell that, what he said.
There were two entrances to the Soviet embassy. One of them was for street traffic and the other was for automobiles. And in the drawing that the colonel did for us, he showed us, and we could orient it to the photographs that Mary had, which were then uncropped, so that we could see exactly where this man was standing, what angles these pictures had been taken from, and Colonel Nechaparenko showed us where the American surveillance camera was located across the street in a shop that was owned by a man who was an asset of the Central Intelligence Agency. So we can state now with tremendous conviction that this was a legitimate picture, but certainly not of Mr. Oswald, and according to the colonel and his associate, Mr. Kostakov, it was not of a man named, as identified in the Lopez report, as Moskalov. So we can throw that out.
That's all.
Okay. In the case of Lee Harvey Oswald in Mexico City, what we don't know is more likely to distract us from proper evaluation of what we do know. So examination of this mystery must address the following questions, which we shall do so on this panel. 1, did Oswald go to Mexico City? If so, what was the purpose of his trip? 2, if the answer to the first part of 1 is yes, did he go to either the Cuban or Russian embassies? 3, if the answer to that question is yes, how did he manage to avoid detection by surveillance cameras on all 5 occasions? Counting entrances and exits, this number must be doubled. 4, were Oswald's visits to either of these foreign embassies the work of an imposter? And 5, during the time of his alleged visits, was there an attempt to implicate Oswald in the upcoming murder of JFK? If so, was that attempt connected to the very blatant attempt to do just that during the course of the Odio incident, an event which occurred 36 hours prior to Oswald's alleged arrival in Mexico City? And we ought to give a little bit of background on the Odio incident. It involved a late September visit by 3 men to the Dallas apartment of an anti-Castro Cuban exile, Sylvia Odio. The cast, she claims, included Leon Oswald and 2 Hispanics, Leopoldo and Angelo. Leopoldo made it clear that the names they gave were war names, a common practice in underground activities. Aside from introducing themselves, Leopoldo did all the talking. He claimed that he and his friends were anti-Castro activists. They were aware that Odio's parents were in a Cuban jail for harboring a man accused of conspiring to murder Castro. They would appreciate Sylvia's help in writing letters encouraging local businessmen to donate money to the anti-Castro cause. Odio was suspicious and put them off. Her younger sister, Annie Laurie, saw the men and heard their conversation. In a telephone call from Leopoldo a day or 2 later, he asked Sylvia what she thought of Leon. Sylvia was non-committal. Leopoldo told her, Leon is kind of loco, an ex-Marine and an expert marksman. He says Kennedy should have been assassinated after the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans didn't have the guts to do it. According to recent investigation, including an October 17th telephone interview with Sylvia Odio, the visit by the trio occurred at 9 p.m. on the evening of September 25th. Although the FBI gathered falsified statements which discredited Odio with the Warren Commission, their work disintegrated a couple of weeks after publication of the Commission's report. But the damage to Odio's credibility continued until Congress voted to reinvestigate President Kennedy's assassination. The House Assassinations Report states, quote, the committee tended to believe Sylvia Odio and her sister Annie Laurie Odio, unquote. To this day, there is zero doubt in Sylvia Odio's mind that Leon Oswald was the man later accused of shooting the president. Her sister Annie Laurie supports this opinion. It is possible that Leon was impersonating the real Oswald. In terms of its effect on proving that a conspiracy was in progress, it makes no difference. If Sylvia Odio's recall of this incident is credible, and there are many reasons to believe her, the substance of Leopoldo's telephone conversation with her is inescapable evidence of a pre-assassination conspiracy to frame Oswald for the murder of JFK, an effort which occurred many weeks prior to the president's visit to Dallas. It also cries out to validate the concept of a conspiracy to murder President Kennedy. Okay, now we move on to our 5 questions, the first of which is, did Lee Harvey Oswald in fact go to Mexico City? And to start that discussion, I'd like to call on Gaten Fonzie.
First of all, I'd like to say that I wasn't involved in the Mexico City investigation with the House Select Committee, and I'm sorry we don't have Eddie Lopez or Danny Hardway here, who would have provided first-hand information in that part of the investigation. I'm going to rely on a chronology developed by Bob Dorf, an excellent chronology, to set the timing of these various events here. But in addition, I'd like to provide my own perspective of this whole thing in terms of the area that I was involved with. And I think one of the things you have to remember is that this whole Mexico City scenario came under the umbrella of David Atlee Phillips, who is a major figure in my book. And he becomes a major figure in my book as a result of determining that he was the master spy known as Maurice Bishop, who was seen with Oswald prior to the assassination. And so coincidentally, when we stumbled upon Phillips as possibly being Maurice Bishop, the initial discovery of that, we later also found out that Phillips was in fact in charge of all the misinformation and disinformation that came out of the Mexico City area. And I was involved in questioning him in an informal way. He had appeared before the committee and given sworn testimony and perjured himself on certain issues. And so we brought him back in an informal way to question him about the misinformation stories that had come out of Mexico City immediately following the assassination. And we determined that almost every one of them came from assets that Phillips controlled. And so when we look at Mexico City as a whole, I think we have to keep in mind that we're looking at a picture that may have been largely painted by a master of psychological warfare and disinformation. In fact, the agency's most masterful manipulator of minds. So that, with that preface, I'll try to go through some of the details of the chronology here. In New Orleans on June 24th, 1963, the real Oswald applied for and received a passport issued on the 25th. Inevitably, this raises the question, how did a former communist defector get a passport overnight? Only two obvious possible reasons. One was there was a bureaucratic blunder, and the other was he got special treatment. On September 17th, Oswald had applied for and received a 15-day tourist permit from the Mexican consulate in New Orleans. The permit was valid for 90 days. On Tuesday, September 24th, Oswald appeared at the New Orleans Department of Employment Security to fill out the weekly claim for unemployment compensation. From this point, the record of Oswald's movements are confusing and difficult to verify. Mrs. Garner, Oswald's landlady, told investigators she saw Oswald for the last time at 4 or 5 o'clock on the evening of the 23rd. Further, she found his apartment vacated on the 24th or 25th. A Texas Employment Commission check payable to Oswald was cashed between 8 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the 25th at a store in New Orleans. It should be noted that the FBI was not able to authenticate Oswald's endorsement on the back of the check. If the endorsement on the employment compensation check is valid, it seems likely that Oswald remained in New Orleans until at least 8 a.m. on the 25th. Oswald's handwritten change of address card was received at the Lafayette Street branch of the New Orleans Post Office on September 26th. It was postmarked New Orleans, 11 a.m., September 25th. Ruth and Michael Payne's home in Irving, Texas was listed in the space for the forwarding address. The next verification of Oswald's whereabouts is on the morning of Friday, September 27th, when he is alleged to have signed the guest register at the Hotel Comercio in Mexico City. This had to have occurred subsequent to 10:30 a.m., which is when the bus he supposedly traveled on arrived in that city. Oswald's signature was authenticated by the FBI and backed up by the House Committee's panel of handwriting experts. In the 48-hour period subsequent to his departure from New Orleans, a plethora of sightings of Oswald have been reported. The ubiquitous quality of these sightings is essential to making a judgment about their meaning. Here's a chronology. Austin-based Selective Service official Mrs. Lee Danley thought that Oswald was in her office at 1 p.m. on the 25th. If the remainder of the chronology is accurate, and I believe it is, Mrs. Donnelly probably was mistaken. The Warren Commission assumed Oswald departed from New Orleans on Continental Trailway bus number 5120 or 5121 on 12:20 p.m. on the 25th. Its scheduled arrival in Houston was 10:50 p.m. This, too, tends to undermine Mrs. Donnelly's story. However, there are no known witnesses who can confirm seeing Oswald on that bus. It's merely an assumption. On September 25th, Oswald is alleged to have called the wife of a Socialist Labor Party official named Horace Twyford at his home between the hours of 7 and 10 p.m. Oswald stated that he was calling from Houston and would be flying to Mexico in a few hours. The call could have originated from almost any place and may well have been disinformation. On September 26th, the Warren Commission told us that Oswald boarded a Laredo-bound Continental Trailways bus in Houston at 2:35 a.m. Two passengers, Mr. and Mrs. McFarland, claimed they first noticed Oswald at about 6 a.m., indicating he could have gotten on the bus at any time prior to that. Now, recent investigations show that if this individual was Oswald, he would have had to have traveled from Dallas to Houston in approximately 5 hours, 246 driving miles, to catch the bus he is alleged to have taken from Houston to Laredo. The Continental Trailways bus Oswald supposedly rode from Houston to Laredo arrived in Laredo at 1:20 p.m. on the 26th. For many years, Sylvia Odio fixed the arrival of Oswald and his two Latin companions at 9 p.m. on either the 25th, 26th, or 27th. She recalls specifically that framework because that weekend she was preparing to move from one apartment to another. Now, recently, the frontline people have developed information from Father McCann, who was a friend of Sylvia's, and he recalled that on the night of the 27th, he had a telephone conversation with Sylvia. When it was a Friday evening.
That's not quite right.
I know.
He didn't know the date. We found the date by going to SMU Library and getting the clipping.
I was getting to that. Yeah.
But he didn't know the date when
Okay.
he first heard
Yeah, I
it.
was getting to that. What happened was that he remembered that Janet Leigh, the movie star, was coming to Dallas to attend the Texas Mental Health Association charity benefit on Friday night. Mary went to the library and got the Dallas Times-Herald edition of Friday the 27th and pinpointed the date for that Friday. Subsequently, amazingly enough, when Frontline talked to Father McCann, they didn't go back to Sylvia Odio and confirm with her. She happened to call me just a few weeks ago and told me that she recalls now that on that Wednesday, prior, at the time of the visit of the men, she was going out to meet Father McCann. And that's how the date got confirmed by Sylvia as being the 25th. So what we have is, if Oswald left New Orleans on the 25th, he could have covered the 512 miles to Dallas in time to arrive at Odio's apartment that evening. Sylvia recalls Oswald and his companions appearing weary and mentioned that they had been on a long journey. They departed in a red automobile in which Leon was a passenger. Oswald was a passenger. Bear in mind that Oswald did not know how to drive. If the real Oswald caught the bus which left Houston at 2:35 a.m. on the 26th, there is no possibility of his being in Dallas on the night of the 26th or 27th. On that basis, we can say with certainty that the visit to Odio occurred on the 25th. At this point, two additional questions must be answered. If Oswald was on his way to Mexico City, why would he go by way of Dallas? And more curiously, if his fair play for Cuba posture was for real, and his avowed Marxism and admiration for Castro genuine, what on earth was he doing in the company of anti-Castro Cubans? Visiting another anti-Castro Cuban, seeking her support and raising funds for anti-Castro causes. According to Fletcher Rojas's records, the bus company, the bus Oswald allegedly rode to the capital departed from Nuevo Laredo at 2:15 p.m. This is confirmed by Mexican immigration records, CD 598A and 24-55, 550. In Monterey, two Australian girls named Mumford and Winston boarded the bus. They claim to have had a conversation with the person who identified himself as Lee Oswald, and they are certain that it was in fact Oswald. Their conversation is said to have included references to Oswald's 2-year stay in Russia, the fact that he was trying to get to Russia, where he hoped to talk with Fidel Castro, recollections of his previous trips to Mexico City, and his recommendation of the Hotel Cuba as a good place to stay. Oswald rarely volunteered information except when he was trying to make an impression, as he was at the American Embassy in Moscow when he announced his defection, and also following his arrest, and he appeared on the radio and television debates after he had distributed Fair Play for Cuba leaflets in New Orleans. If these activities were predicated on spreading disinformation, they lend support to George de Morenseal's observation that Oswald was a great actor. If Oswald was on his way to Mexico to check out a post-assassination escape route, the last thing he wanted to do would be to call attention to himself. If, on the other hand, he was, wittingly or unwittingly, helping to set himself up as a decoy in concert with other co-conspirators in a plot to assassinate the president, the behavior attributed to him by fellow passengers would make sense. But such a scenario is hard to swallow. Oswald may have had many faults. Being a moron was not one of them. However, his vehement protest to reporters that he was being led along the hallway at Dallas Police Headquarters lends weight to the proposition that he had to have been aware that there had been a conspiracy to murder Kennedy. I didn't shoot the president. I didn't shoot anybody. I'm just a patsy, he said.
Gayton, may I comment on something that you have just said? You said that it was, if his Fair Play for Cuba activities were real, what was he doing soliciting funds for anti-Castro Cubans? This was in September. In August, he had done exactly the same thing. He had approached Bringuer with offering help to train the anti-Castro Cubans, and gave him, as though trying to establish this fact beyond a doubt, he gave him his Marine Corps manual and showed him all the training things in there. And a couple of days later, he's out there with protest, Viva Fidel. I mean, he's out there with a placard saying, you know, let's help Fidel Castro, fair play for Cuba. And this just within, and I believe Bringuer, when he said he ran up to him furious, and he said, all right, Jose, hit me if you want to. So his conduct was contradictory a number of times.
Right down the line, I believe. But, you know, in looking for motivation in terms of his visit to Odio, I think we should also consider the possibility of a pattern of disinformation here that, again, fits David Atlee Phillips' program and all the disinformation schemes he did. He didn't focus in on one area when he was laying down disinformation programs. He placed them from the right to the left, the whole spectrum, and the bottom line was confusion. But the confusion always tended to weigh in a certain direction, usually in the case of Oswald, either with pro-Castro or Russian connections. And so I think what we have to remember here also is that Sylvia Odio, had a strong connection to Hure, which was the anti-Castro Cuban group run by Manola Rai, founded by Manola Rai. And Manola Rai was considered the most leftist. He was a social democrat, the most leftist of all the anti-Cuban groups. And he was hated by the more ultra-right-wing anti-Castro Cuban groups, which were mostly all the rest. He was despised so much by E. Howard Hunt that Hunt resigned as the CIA's liaison with the Cuban front because the State Department insisted that Manola Rai be put on this umbrella group. Hunt, in fact, considered Manola Rai as bad as Castro himself. Fidelissimo sin Fidel, he would say. And I think there's a possibility here that Sylvia Odio was selected because of that connection to her. Her father was one of the founders with Manola Rai. Her father was in jail in Cuba at the time. And so to come to Sylvia Odo may have been, and I raise this just as speculation, may have been part of a misinformation program that tried to link Oswald to the most leftist of the anti-Castro Cuban groups.
May I comment on that for a second? I think that the Odio incident, which many of us are agreed is the strongest evidence that we have of a conspiracy. One of the things about it that's very troubling is it's hard to imagine that either Oswald by himself or with the companions who finally showed up with him at Sylvia Odio's apartment at 9 o'clock in the evening of the 25th, it's awfully difficult to imagine that they would leave New Orleans, that they would travel as quickly as you would have to travel if you went by car, 512 miles to get to Sylvia Odio's house. They weren't even looking for Sylvia Odio, they were looking for her sister, Sarita, to leave this message that Gayton has just gone into. I think it was far too subtle a nuance to be remembered. If you want to send, if they were going all that way just to send a message, I think that they would have left it with the ABC affiliate there instead of Sylvia Odio. There is something about that entire, the motivation for going to Odio's house that seems very, very difficult to accept, that they would invest all of that time and all of that energy to go there and lay that message on Sylvia Odio. I just don't think that she was important enough to put all that energy into.
If I may just, I don't disagree with Bob entirely, but I still think it's a possibility. The reason perhaps the reason the group was asking for Sarita to begin with was because Sarita's photo had appeared in a paper recently. There were a group of former wealthy Cuban women coming into Dallas at that time, and there were some photographs of anti-Castro activists, and her photo had appeared in connection with her relationship, her father's relationship to Hure. But I think the point that Bob's comment leads to is that what we may be looking at here is the tip of an iceberg that we're, the depth of which and width of which we have no idea. It may have been part of another scenario that we don't know anything about yet at this point because it simply hasn't come up. The whole Odio incident didn't come up. Sylvia Odio and her sister had agreed not to mention the incident at all because they were so frightened and terrified when they saw Oswald's picture on television. And the only one they told was their sister Sarita, who in turn told Mrs. Cannell, who had been sort of the protectorate of the three girls. She worked with the Cuban Refugee Service. And Mrs. Cannell, in checking out, when I was involved in the investigation, checking out her background and the background of her husband, I had some suspicions about her connections. So again, that whole thing may have, they didn't have to go to ABC. They could have just gone to Mrs. Cannell, and it would have come out.
Okay, we've got a little bit far afield, but I think we can all agree the answer to the question is Oswald did go to Mexico City. With that in mind, did Lee Harvey Oswald go to either the Cuban or Russian embassies in Mexico City? And I'd like to call on Robert Dorf to address that question.
There are only two pieces of incontrovertible evidence which place Oswald in Mexico City. The first, of course, is his signature on the register at the Hotel Comercio, which has been authenticated. The second is his signature on a Cuban transit visa application form, which has also been authenticated. In opposition to that evidence, there are problems concerning the origin of one of the above referenced documents, plus at least 3 eyewitnesses to meetings with an Oswald whose description is in serious conflict with the basic physical characteristics of the real Lee Harvey Oswald. For the moment, we should return to the official chronology of Oswald's alleged activities. On Friday morning, someone calling himself Oswald appeared at the Cuban consulate in Mexico City and encountered a 25-year-old Mexican national, Sylvia Duran. As secretary to the consul, Duran's area of responsibility included helping applicants apply for visas to travel to Cuba. Her recollections about Oswald's visits to the Cuban embassy, elicited during a deposition taken by 3 staff members of the House Assassinations Committee in June 1978, is a patchwork of confirmations and contradictions. Oswald, she claims, came to see her on 3 occasions, all of them occurring on Friday, September the 27th, and all within the space of approximately 6.5 hours. The first visit occurred between 10:30 and 11 a.m. Oswald showed Duran an array of newspaper clippings and other materials calculated to prove that he was a communist. This, quote, evidence, end quote, included references to Oswald's marriage to a Russian citizen, his arrest in New Orleans for activities on behalf of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, and his support for Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Oswald explained that he was on his way to Russia, and he wanted to stop over in Cuba to observe the revolution there. Because of the limitations of his tourist visa, it was imperative, he insisted, that he depart for Cuba in the next 3 days. Duran advised Oswald that he must have a visa from the Russians before the consul could issue a transit visa to Cuba. When she asked him for pictures to attach to the visa application, Oswald told her that he had no pictures. She suggested where photos could be obtained, and he left. Sometime before 1 p.m., Oswald returned with the pictures, which Duran recalled depicted him in the same clothing that he was wearing. And that is a very, very important point that we just stumbled into this afternoon in discussing this with Colonel Necheparenko, and I think we'll let Mary Farrell describe what that is.
The FBI and CIA could never determine in Mexico City where this, I have 2 lightness and darkness of this thing. The picture on the visa. He was gone approximately 2 hours, and she said he came back with this little picture that looks like something you used to stick a quarter in a machine in a 10-cent store and get 3 pictures years ago. They checked within a 150-mile radius of Mexico City and could never find where this picture had been made. She said, yes, that's the man, and he's dressed exactly like he was before and after. But we asked Colonel Necheparenko to look at this, and he says this is the man, but it's not the clothing. And he described the kind of clothing he had on in our room this morning when he said he was just dressed like I am, a T-shirt and a windbreaker and just slacks like this. Would you comment on that, Colonel?
Yes. The man, the visitor who человек, который появился в нашем посольстве где-то приблизительно в час, около часа.
The man who appeared at our embassy around 1 p.m.
У нашего дежурного у ворот охранник, который стоял у ворот там и встречал посетителей, он обратился к нему с просьбой поговорить с кем-то из консулов.
He asked the guardian who was staying near their embassy to talk to any consuls or authorities at the embassy.
В это время в консульском отделе на приеме посетителей
As a receptionist at the consulate department in the embassy
находился Валерий Владимирович Костиков.
was Valery Vladimirovich Kostikov.
И дежурный представил его Освальду,
And,
или посетителю.
and the guardian, the guard, he
Он представлен был посетителю.
he was presented to that vice consul, to Kostikov.
Да.
Did you
Посетитель.
see, pardon me, did you see him at the same trip when he was presented to Kostikov?
Yes.
And how was he dressed?
Just after some minutes, maybe 15 or 20 minutes of talk with Kostikov, he was staying there in reception room of our consular section. And Kostikov called me to the other building, asking to come to consular section to talk with some visitor who was asking for entrance visa to our country because he was afraid and he was persecuted by American authorities, and he mentioned, the American authorities mentioned FBI. He explained that he before lived in our country, has a Russian wife, and now he wanted to return to our country. So when I approached to consular reception room, some unknown man, unknown person, was staying in the door of this reception room, waiting something, because Kostikov asked him to go away from the room when he called me. So I saw some person unknown to me in some short sportive jacket, T-shirt, and trousers, something like jeans, but not jeans. When I passed by him and say good day, he answered only with the head. So, and after this, I met with Kostikov in consular section room, and he explained me again the reason of this visit of this unknown man, and invited him to follow our speaking with him. After this, Kostikov left the room because he has some appointment, and we followed our talk. The unknown visitor showed some documents confirming his staying in Soviet Russia before, and his name was Lee Harvey Oswald by documents and by his American passport. So during our talk, he repeated the same history, the same story, which he said to Kostikov. And then I repeat our procedure of entrance visa for foreigners. He was disappointed during the talk was quite agitated and left after our talk, left the embassy disappointed, and he expressed that he need visa immediately, not for a long months after, because he said that he had some fear and he is in troubles there in the United States. The next day, it was Saturday, 28th of September. He visited the embassy in the morning, and we were there for volleyball playing. So, because why he met another time the same people in the embassy, in consular section, because we used these rooms for change our clothes for playing inside their embassy. At that time, he repeated the story, but was very agitated, very nervous, and repeated the story about persecution by FBI, and expressed his fear of his life. And during this talk, produced the gun, the revolver, and said that he needed and he keep it for his self-defense, self-protection, because he is in danger, because he is afraid of his life. He didn't mention exactly who is menaced to his life. And during this talk, he insisted and he exposed that he need the visa for our country, and that he want to return and to live in peace in the Soviet Russia. During the talk, I didn't participate in this meeting. I was in next enclosed room, but when I entered the room before, he was talking with my two colleagues, Yatskov and Kostikov, and the gun was on the table before Lee Harvey Oswald. Their colleagues tried to calm him. Yatskov gave him a glass of water to take, and after some talks, from agitated state, from nervous tension, and from some very agitated movements, he began to be hysterical, began cry, and became in depression after this. So he wasn't, when he prepared to leave their consular section, he just say that in case anybody would persecute him, he maybe use the gun. It was his phrase we remembered after, because at that day it was, for us it was nothing. So when he went away in the gate, Kostikov was the person who helped him to go away from the embassy. And in the gate, he tried to cover his face with a jacket and take the way to the right, outside the embassy. So Well, now I just tell in some more short way, no? But in the book you can see it in details. Never we had doubts about the person who visited our embassy as a Lee Harvey Oswald, because after the assassination, we identified him by TV from Dallas, by direct transmission from Dallas. And he was actual Lee Harvey Oswald, who was considered as an alleged assassin of the president. And as I remember, we discussed, Yatskov met with Asquith, Cuban consul at that time. And between them, they discussed these visits. And they have discussion about the same man. So it's possible to have different speculations about the fact of visits. If the person who visited our embassy was imposter or actual Oswald, I can say only that it was actual Oswald who visited our embassy. What about Cuban consulate? I just know that during meetings, as I said, between Yatskov and Asquith, there weren't doubts about the same person.
Thank you, Colonel.
Excuse me.
The colonel is convinced, I believe you're convinced, it was Lee Harvey Oswald who
Yes.
visited your...
Yes.
And yet, I see such a different demeanor in this young man who is so agitated and crying almost because he's being refused immediate transit to Russia, and the calm demeanor of the man who was arrested for the crime of the century a couple of months later, and he tells his mother, don't believe the so-called evidence, and he tells his wife to be sure to buy baby shoes. There's just such a contrast. What do you think?
Yes. It also is very interesting because the way that the colonel described Oswald's behavior was the same way that Duran described his behavior. And yet Duran said that the man who came to the embassy, she has made different statements on that. But she called him blonde and short, which I can see immediately disagree with, in her original description of him. And Asquith said categorically in front of the House Assassinations Committee that the man shot in the basement of the Dallas Police Department and the man who came to his embassy were not the same person.
In 78.
I beg your pardon? Yes.
15 years, and he had, I think, 70 and more years old.
Yes. But there's another point there, and that is that you who told me earlier today that that embassy is covered by the surveillance cameras of the United States Intelligence Service
Yeah.
have no picture of Mr. Oswald going into the to the Russian embassy, and as a matter of fact, not into the Cuban embassy. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, it's their responsibility of CIA station.
Yes, and also, I just thought to add, because we asked you earlier, that the Russian intelligence service did not have any photographic surveillance of any of the embassies in Mexico City. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Gaten?
No, the question I wanted to ask the Colonel is what, and it's total supposition on his part, why do you think there were no pictures of Oswald coming into the Russian embassy? Or do you believe that there were?
Why? I think it's, for me, it's very difficult to answer why. At that moment, I haven't some source in CIA station covered by American embassy. So I just can suggest or suppose why.
From your information, what were how were the cameras set up? How many cameras were there? Where were they placed? Could you tell us that?
I described today with Mr. Dorf where the observation post was organized by CIA station.
And you were familiar with them? You knew they were there at the time?
Yes, yes. And they used this during years, not only one, not only in front of our gates, but in other places, covering our garden. They're inside the territory of the embassy. But this observation post, again, in front of our gates, they used for taking the pictures of the people who entered and exit from there. And most of all, they used, as I know, taking the pictures with the people who wasn't by their his face as Latin Americans, but they selected the visitors with the face of Americans or European type, no?
Would you say
So I cannot say why, or maybe they considered Lee Harvey Oswald as some Latin American man.
Gee, David Phillips would have liked that one. No, one of the things that I think should be added to what you said is that while you said that you're unable to explain why they have no pictures, the CIA just said that the cameras weren't working that day.
Yeah.
And,
It's explanation by David Etley Phillips.
yes. Yeah.
But you said that he was in deception area of war. So I cannot answer why. Or was distracted or something more, something other. Because David Etley Phillips in his book Watch
Night Watch. Night Watch.
Night Watch, yeah. Explained the mixture or mistake of the voice of
We're gonna get to
which
that
was taped by CIA station,
We're going to get to that.
and the picture of the man which we discussed there, which appeared in Warren Commission report. This supposed American former serviceman. So, but in other case, in other time, David Etley Phillips said that other call was tapped, alleged Lee Harvey Oswald voice, when he, or imposter, I don't know, said during this call, I need to speak with military attaché from our country, and I need to ask, what about my information and your payment for this information for my trip to the USSR? It was, I consider it's very special, as we call it, active measure or deception, because it was, as appeared this description of this call appeared in other days when Oswald was in the United States.
Yes, after he had returned to the United States.
Yeah.
Moving right along to the next part of this, Duran reminded Oswald that the transit visa could not be issued until he supplied her with a visa from the country of final destination, in this case Russia, so Oswald departed again, presumably bound for the Russian embassy. In the afternoon, perhaps as late as 5 p.m., Oswald returned without the visa from the Russians, but with assurances to Duran that the Russians had agreed to supply the visa forthwith. Duran called the Russian embassy to confirm Oswald's status. Speaking in Spanish, she went over the problem and was informed that the visa had to come from Moscow and would not be issued for at least 4 months. Duran claimed that she alone conversed with the Russians. She advised Oswald of what she had been told. Oswald grew obstinate and began raising his voice. She retreated to the office of Consul Azque and informed him of the problems with the Americans. Azque went to Duran's office and tried to reason with Oswald, but the angry American wasn't having it. He had to get to Cuba within the next 3 days. The projected delay was an example of petty bureaucracy. He was a friend of the Cuban Revolution, and on at the top of his lungs. Azque soon tired of this and told him to leave. In her testimony to the House Assassinations Committee staffers, in volume 3 of page 6 through 119, Duran presents the following contradictions to the official version of Oswald at the Cuban embassy. On the one hand, she was quite certain that the photo attached to the visa application and a November 23rd newspaper photo of Oswald, the man she saw on television coverage from Dallas, depicted the same person who visited the embassy on Friday, September the 27th. During the questioning by Mexican authorities just after the assassination, however, Duran described Oswald as, quote, short and blonde. The House Assassinations Committee's Mexico City report establishes that the CIA omitted that part of her description from the translation provided to the Warren Commission. In 2 subsequent memos to the Warren Commission, the agency corrected this deletion, which is a Commission document 426, page 4. The first memo didn't reach the Commission staff until January the 31st. By that time, the Warren Commission seemed immune to the discrepancy in Duran's description of Oswald. The other major contradiction in her identification of Oswald occurred during her deposition in front of the House Assassinations Committee's group that went down to interview her. Quote, blue eyes, almost green. Blonde hair, almost white. Height about equal to her own. She was 5 foot 3.5 tall. Weight equal to that of one of her interrogators, Edwin Lopez, who weighed at the time 119 pounds. Oswald, she claims, spoke to her in English with a trembling voice and seemed pathetic. On the original record of Lee Harvey Oswald's enlistment in the Marine Corps, it notes that he had hazel eyes. In 1963, the data on his June 25, 1963 passport application indicates he had gray eyes, brown hair, and was 5 feet 11 inches tall. His weight on an employment application dated October the 15th, 1963, was 150 pounds, height 5 foot 9 inches tall. His fingerprint identification card following his arrest in New Orleans indicated brown eyes, 5 foot 9 inches tall, and a weight of 136 pounds. His death certificate on November the 25th, 1963, listed his height as 5 foot 9 inches, weight 131 pounds, blue eyes. During an appearance before the House Assassinations Committee in Washington, retired Cuban consular official Azque told his version of the Oswald visit to the embassy. He had general recall of 3 visits, but was uncertain if they all occurred on the same day. He stated that the consulate was open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Monday through Friday, and he was quite sure that no one was received there after hours. He was confident that his replacement, Senor Mirabal, saw Oswald on at least 1 and possibly all 3 occasions of his visits to the embassy. Here is Azque's description of Oswald. Quote, over 30 years of age and very thin face, deeply lined, blonde, dark blonde hair. In referring to the pictures of Oswald on the visa application, he stated, quote, 15 years had gone by, so it is very difficult for me to be in a position to guarantee it in a categorical form. But my belief is that this gentleman was not, in fact, the person or the individual who went to the consulate. In direct contradiction to Duran's recollection, Azque was quite certain that the clothes worn by the man who came to the embassy were not the same clothes worn by the man in the photograph attached to the visa. which confirms what Colonel Nechaparenko told us. Although Asque's replacement, Mirabal, saw Oswald only fleetingly, in his testimony before the House Assassinations Committee, he identified Lee Harvey Oswald as the man he saw inside the Cuban embassy. An important addendum to Oswald's alleged activities in Mexico City can be found in Anthony Summers' memorable book Conspiracy. In it, Summers zeroes in on Oscar Contreras. This former law student at the Mexico City University was still a fixture in 1963 with left-wing sentiments. Unlike students in the U.S., it is not uncommon for former students to have a continued presence on the campus. Contreras recalled an evening in late September when he and several of his leftist student friends were lounging in a campus cafeteria. A stranger approached them and introduced himself as Lee Harvey Oswald, a name which he promptly spelled. He was having trouble, he told them, getting to Cuba and wondered if the students might be able to help him to get a visa. A friend of Contreras's, who was well acquainted with the people who worked at the Cuban embassy, including Consul Asque, that evening spoke with Asque on Oswald's behalf. Asque and a Cuban intelligence officer warned Contreras to break off contact with Oswald. They were suspicious of this American. They interpreted his behavior at the consulate as the work of an agent provocateur intent on infiltrating left-wing groups. Contreras described Oswald as more than 30 years old, short, 5'6". Additional thoughts which Contreras shared with Summers have importance. Nothing about the students' conversation in the cafeteria included references to Cuba. How then was it possible for the stranger calling himself Oswald to be aware of the political sympathies of Contreras and his friends and of Contreras' contacts inside the Cuban embassy? This encounter had to be the result of coaching by someone in a position to know of that relationship. So here's the score on the identification of the man who came to the embassy. Oscar Contreras' description of the man who appeared on the campus of the university eliminates Lee Harvey Oswald. The fact that the individual calling himself Oswald spelled the name supports the notion of an imposter. Consul Asque says the man who started a row with him inside the Cuban embassy wasn't Oswald. Consul Mirabal, who saw Oswald only fleetingly, nonetheless says it was Oswald. Sylvia Duran is a draw. Although she first claimed it was Oswald, albeit blonde and short, her description of the man who was in close proximity to her longer than any of the others is more at odds with the appearance of the real Oswald than the descriptions supplied by Asque and Contreras. Additionally, in 1978 or 79, in a meeting with Anthony Summers, and this can be found on page 376 of Conspiracy, Duran claimed that the only post-assassination photo she had seen of Oswald was in a Mexican newspaper. Summers sent Duran other photographs and film footage of Oswald. She told Summers, quote, "I was not sure if it was Oswald or not. The man on the film is not like the man I saw in Mexico City. Other questions about the bona fides of Duran still persist."
Okay, did anybody else want to make a comment before we go on to the next point? Next question? And looking at the time, too, I'd like to, we still got 3 more of these to go through. Let's try to speed up a little bit because we need to have at least 30 minutes for questions and answers. The third question is, how did Oswald, which we kind of got into a minute ago, how did Oswald manage to avoid detection by surveillance cameras on all 5 of his alleged visits to the 2 different embassies? And I'd like to call on Gaten Fonzie.
Shortly after the assassination, American couriers flew from Mexico City to Dallas and Washington, D.C. to deliver what was originally described as surveillance photos of Oswald, supposedly taken as he was entering and departing the Cuban and Russian embassies. Also, in the evidence were transcripts of tape recordings of his voice, allegedly picked up by electronic eavesdropping devices planted in both embassies. That so-called evidence touched off one of the most suspicious and disturbing controversies of the Kennedy assassination investigation. And the debate is still going on, because the photos were of an individual who bore no resemblance to Lee Harvey Oswald. The authenticity of the recordings of Oswald's voice is in grave doubt. In his November 23, 1963 memo to the head of the Secret Service, FBI Director Hoover wrote, "Special agents of this Bureau who have conversed with Oswald in Dallas, Texas, have observed photographs of the individual referred to above and have listened to a recording of his voice. These special agents are of the opinion that the above referred to individual was not Lee Harvey Oswald." The Bureau told the House committee that Hoover's reference to a recording was a mistake, born of confusion, The FBI said they were just reading transcripts. The explanation for that came from Gordon Shanklin, who was in charge of the Dallas office. And as you know, Shanklin was the same individual, FBI official, who ordered the destruction of a note which Oswald had delivered to the FBI shortly before the assassination. Anthony Summers had a recent interview with former FBI Supervisor Lawrence Keenan, and that's also troubling. Sent to Mexico City to head the FBI and CIA's investigation of Oswald's activities, his efforts were greeted with lip service. He returned to Washington totally frustrated. The investigation, he told Summers, was window dressing, and the mention of conspiracy was enough to place a man's career in jeopardy. Surveillance photos, it was later learned, were taken by CIA operatives who had both embassies covered during normal business hours. The problem, of course, was that the photographs were not of Lee Harvey Oswald. The inevitable question was soon raised. Since photographic surveillance encompassed taking pictures of everyone who came in and out of the embassies, why could the CIA not produce photographs of Oswald? And since the so-called transcripts were, as Hoover's memo points out, a recording and the voice not that of Lee Harvey Oswald, whose voice was it? The Mexico City report partially unravels another anomaly. After the contents of an Oswald telephone call to the Soviet embassy on October 1st was reported to the CIA headquarters in Langley, the agency cabled the Mexico City station identifying this individual as Lee Henry Oswald. That identification could only have come from the counterintelligence Special Investigation Group's files, which were listed under control of James Angleton. Oswald was listed as Henry instead of Harvey in those files. Angleton called this his bent card technique. By deliberately changing part of the name, it was possible to trace the origin of the information or leak, if there was one, identifying a person with Oswald's background as having been in contact with Kostikov, the KGB officer in charge of sabotage and assassination in the Western Hemisphere, according to the CIA, had ominous implications. Fuel for the controversy was added in October of this year by recently released writings of former CIA Mexico City station chief Winston Scott, now deceased. Scott wrote, Lee Harvey Oswald became a person of great interest to us during this 27 September to 2 October 1963 period. He contacted the Soviet embassy on at least 4 occasions, and once went directly from the office of Senora Silvia Dorato de Turan, a Mexican employee of the Cuban consulate, to his friends, the Soviets. During the conversation with the Soviet official, he said, I was in the Cuban embassy and they will not give me a transit visa through Cuba until after I have my Soviet visa. This became important after the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President Kennedy was published. For on page 777 of that report, the erroneous statement was made that it was not known that Oswald had visited the Cuban embassy until after the assassination. Every piece of, and I'm quoting Winston Scott's book here, every piece of information concerning Lee Harvey Oswald was reported immediately after it was received. U.S. Ambassador Thomas C. Mann by memorandum, the FBI chief in Mexico by memorandum, and to my headquarters by cable. And included in each and every one of these reports was the conversations Oswald had so far as it was known. These reports were made on all his contacts with both the Cuban consulate and with the Soviets. Because we thought at first that Lee Harvey Oswald might be a dangerous potential defector from the USA to the Soviet Union, he was of great interest to us. So we kept a special watch on him and his activities. He was observed on all his visits to each of the 2 communist embassies, and his conversations with personnel of these embassies were studied in detail so far as we could get them. Together with what is known of what took place during these visits, sufficient to make him a suspect agent acting on behalf of the Soviets in several things, possibly including the assassination of President Kennedy. These visits and conversations are not hearsay, for persons watching these embassies photographed Oswald as he entered and left each one and clocked the time he spent on each visit. So here we have Winston Scott, the head of Mexico City Embassy, announcing that the CIA had photographs and conversations of Lee Harvey Oswald. During his testimony before the House Committee, David Phillips explains things this way. The cameras weren't working during each of Oswald's 5 visits. Mr. Hoover was mistaken about his special agents listening to the recordings, since all that survived of these conversations with the Russian embassy were transcripts of those conversations. The tapes had been routinely destroyed a week or 10 days after they were allegedly made, Phillips said. Photos of the wrong man were sent to Washington, according to Phillips, because of a clerical error. Former Warren Commission lawyer David Slauson recently admitted that he had listened to recordings of supposedly taped conversations of Oswald during his and William Coleman's visit to Mexico City. They were in charge of the Warren Commission's area of that area of investigation. Slauson said, "Yes, I listened to the tape of Lee Harvey Oswald's telephone conversations with the Soviet embassy in Mexico. I did not feel that the voice sounded any different from what I expected his would sound like." And then, of course, he went on to say that he really didn't know what Oswald's voice sounded like, and the recordings were very, very poor quality. He also said, "I can't remember how many tapes there were of Oswald in Mexico." And he's talking about the period of course, of the Warren Commission investigation, which takes us up to 1964, long after David Phillips said the tapes were destroyed. He says, "I can't remember how many tapes there were of Oswald in Mexico, but we were able to listen to as many of them as we wanted to. We listened to some, at least, and we read transcripts of all of them. Oswald talked in English, mostly as I remember, although he may have tried some Russian in his talks with the Russian embassy. The people to whom Oswald spoke English, so there would have been no point in his not using his native language." That's Slauson, Warren Commission Counsel David Slauson, saying that. And he appeared to be very, very straightforward, and there was no reason for him to lie. And Coleman, his partner, told Anthony Summers also recently that he and Slauson listened to lots of tapes. He was certain of this because he had to verify them against the transcripts in order to confirm the accuracy of material in the hands of Chief Justice Warren. Coleman also recalled having seen photos of Oswald, allegedly taken while the accused assassin was in Mexico City. These, he claimed, were easily recognized photos of the man whom the CIA to this very day claims was not photographed. It confirms an allegation in the House Committee's Mexico City report attributed to a CIA agent named Piccolo. There was a photograph of Oswald. Under questioning about this by veteran Kennedy researchers, a senior CIA official who was present during the listening of the tapes and the viewing of the photos at first ducked under his CIA secrecy oath. "I am not authorized to tell what was in the files." When asked if he at least had a remembrance of hearing Oswald's tapes, he replied, "I am not authorized to say what was in my head in those days." In a subsequent interview, he was more forthcoming. Yes, he said, there were some tapes. It was a kind of iffy for quite a while whether or not this was Oswald's voice. As for the photographs, there was no doubt at all. There was, he said, a strong case to be made for it. Then he referred to a place in the Orient which has 5,000 faces on display, presumably to represent the 5 different types of faces to be found anywhere in the world. "I suppose," he said, "you could find Oswald's face in that collection. If you examine a lot of murky faces, you can make them look like any damn thing you want. I don't think it would stand up in a court of law." David Phillips died in 1988, but his lies linger on. One of the agency's former directors, Richard Helms, saved himself from jail term by pleading nolo contender on charges of lying to the Senate Intelligence Committee, of course. His lies were looked upon as an act of heroism by hardline agency employees who had passed the hat to pay Helms' fine. I've got a chapter on all this in my book on the Mexico City business and David Phillips' relationship to it. I won't get into that whole business about David Phillips' relationship with, as I mentioned before, Antonio Viciana, and the fact that he was seen with Oswald, but I think it's directly related to what we've been talking about here.
So, did Oswald go to the Cuban or the Soviet embassy?
Well, I think the basic question still remains, as you originally put it. Why would the CIA not produce photographs of Oswald and tape recordings of Oswald if they, in fact, had them? I think that's the question we're still left with. And I think it's the key question as far as whether or not Oswald...
Talk about off the wall.
I think we're peeling the sides off the walls, literally here.
Okay, let's go to 4.
You want to go to? Okay, let's go to the fourth question then. Were the Oswald visits to either the Soviet or Cuban embassies the work of an imposter? Bob Dorf.
In the case of the Soviet embassy, we cannot be certain. How's that? The CIA could not produce photos of Oswald going in or out. A telephone call Oswald is alleged to have placed to the embassy occurred on October the 4th when Oswald was in Dallas. In the case of the Cuban embassy, the visits were clearly the work of an imposter. There are many reasons to reach this conclusion and only one to reject it, which is the signature on the Cuban transit visa application. In his secret testimony before the House Assassination Committee staffers, David Phillips acknowledged that, quote, his shop had 2 assets inside the Cuban embassy. It would not have been, that's the end of that quote, it would not have been too difficult, if you think about it for a minute, for one of them to retrieve the Oswald visa application from Duran's files and replace it with one bearing the real Oswald's photo and signature. This, of course, would have to have been accomplished prior to the application being sent on to Havana. Phillips specifically excluded Sylvia Duran from the embassy personnel who were on the CIA's payroll. His proclivity, however, for bald-faced lying demands that skepticism be applied to every nuance of what he says. Someone at the Mexico City CIA station motivated Mexican security agents to arrest and isolate Duran shortly after the shots rang out in Dallas. A firestorm of frantic communications erupted between CIA headquarters and their Mexico City station regarding Duran's arrest. An analysis of this highly suspicious event and its aftermath requires too much space for consideration here. Suffice to say, one wonders why such extreme measures were instituted against a minor employee of the Cuban consulate for processing an American's request for a transit visa. Oswald could have signed the hotel register and not gone to either embassy. In the alternative, a second register, including Oswald's signature, would not have been too difficult to create. There was other evidence of Oswald having been in Mexico: bus tickets, bullfight tickets, pamphlets, and the like. The manager of the Hotel Comercio told Summers he recalled Oswald as having been a guest at the hotel. The contents of Oswald's November the 8th letter from the to the Russian embassy in New York contain allegations which make clear that Oswald was aware of some of the particulars concerning events which transpired at both embassies. That information notwithstanding, during his interrogation by Dallas police, Oswald specifically denied having traveled to Mexico City. Reports of that denial are at odds with recollections by others who claim that Oswald admitted going there. It is also possible that Oswald was in Mexico long enough to sign the visa application in a place other than the interior of the Cuban embassy. There seems little doubt that he was in Mexico. Doubts about what he did while he was there are a different matter. The evidence against the real Oswald visiting the Cuban embassy is overwhelming. A, the surveillance cameras could not possibly have revealed, would most certainly have revealed his entrances and his exits. Had they existed, the CIA would have been overjoyed to produce even one of such a precious commodity. The tremendous disparity between the descriptions of the man claiming to be Oswald and the real Lee Harvey Oswald would not be an issue if Oswald was actually at the embassy. The description of the person who introduced himself as Lee Harvey Oswald to Oscar Contreras and his friends lends credence to other instances of the deployment of an Oswald imposter. HSC staffer lawyer Edwin Lopez was one of the 3 members of the committee's team that went to Mexico City. Lopez told me that he examined every roll of film shot by the CIA's photographers during the requisite period of surveillance of both embassies, and that he was convinced that no photos were taken of anyone who resembled Lee Harvey Oswald. The frames on the negatives were numbered sequentially, and Lopez was able to account for every one of them. Now, he does, in his House Assassinations Committee's Mexico City report, indicate that he had strong suspicions that there were other rolls of surveillance films which may have been withheld. One of the great pities about this entire episode was that Duran, Azcue, and Mirabal were not given the opportunity to review the photos Lopez examined. Unless some CIA official ordered a temporary stoppage of the surveillance to eliminate exposing one of their agents, the person calling himself Oswald could not have avoided detection. If Winston Scott is to be believed, Oswald, or the person calling himself Oswald, had to have been photographed at least 10 times.
Anybody want to speak to that one? We'll go to the last one. Okay. During the time of his alleged visits, was there an attempt then to implicate Oswald in the upcoming murder of JFK? Gaten?
To me, this is the most mysterious of the sub-mysteries in this whole area, because we have, on the one hand, supposedly while Oswald was on his way to Mexico City, immediately before, he stops by, or he's led to stop by with these 2 Cuban, anti-Castro Cuban associates at Sylvia Odio's, and 2 days later, or a day or 2 later in the evening, Leopoldo calls Sylvia Odio and says, you know, this American Marine, he thinks we Cubans were crazy for not having killed Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, or words to that effect. So that immediately, and of course I think the most important evidence developed by the House Committee in its entire investigation was the proving the credibility of Sylvia Odio in her story, including this, because she told individuals about this before the assassination. So what we have here is, in fact, what seemed to be a blatant attempt to link Oswald to the Kennedy assassination before the Kennedy assassination. And yet he goes through that whole scenario in Mexico City, if it was Oswald, without making any attempt to link himself or to be linked to the coming Kennedy assassination. But it's important that it would seem that he be linked to Castro trying to get to Havana, trying to get to Russia, and trying to get to Cuba. And I think what is perhaps most revealing or most significant in all this is an explanation for it that Castro himself gave to the House Committee when representatives of it went down to talk to him. And I'd like to quote Castro here. He's talking to House Committee Chairman Stokes. He says, there is something I would like to add in that connection. You see, it was always very much suspicious to me that a person who later appeared to be involved in Kennedy's death would have requested a visa from Cuba, because I said to myself, what would have happened had by any chance that man come to Cuba, visited Cuba, gone back to the States, and then appeared to be involved in Kennedy's death? That would have really been a provocation, a gigantic provocation. Now, can you imagine if that person had been to Cuba in October, and then in November, the President of the United States would have been killed? I think probably Castro had the greatest insight into this whole incident.
Before we open the entire discussion to questions, anybody on the panel want to comment about anything that's been said recently? Or are we ready to, anyone that's got questions, want to get in line over here? We can go on and start. Whoever wants to be the first brave soul to approach the microphone.
My question is for Mary Farrell. Do you feel there's still any currency in the Hugh McDonald identification of the mystery man in the photograph as the mysterious assassin Saul?
Oh, I've never thought that. I'm sorry. I've never had any inclination to believe that book at all. You're talking about McDonald's book.
Do you credit that to McDonald's personal credibility, or what?
I talked to Mr. McDonald, and I have the tape of the conversation. Mr. McDonald didn't know what was in that book. He never wrote that book. And I would say, well, now you said that he did this and he did that. Well, I don't remember that. And I said, I don't think you wrote the book. Well, I had help. So no, I've never believed that book.
This is for Mr. Necheparenko. I'd like to know how he wound up here, or where do you live, and who is your current employer?
After my retirement, and before, I'm living in Moscow, and during last 2 years, I worked on this research. I worked in archives in Minsk, and I studied many literature published here in the United States, the reports of official investigation commissions, and publication by many American authors. And I tried to give the new information that before never appeared from Minsk, from our headquarters in Moscow about Lee Harvey Oswald. And first of all, I think the information about Oswald in Mexico City, Oswald in our embassy in Mexico City, because I consider that speculations about this visits, there are more than all the speculations about this person and about the tragedy in Dallas in general. About your question on my life now, well, now I want to rest some time after this book, because I suffered in some kind, preparing it. I mean, with the limits of time, because I tried to give it for this anniversary, and I wanted. I'm happy now that I participated in such very important meeting for me, and I consider for other researchers, because now we can compare the information from both sides. Well, I live with my wife in Moscow, and my grandchild with my daughter is living in the United States, because my daughter is working here with his husband in our embassy in Aeroflot. And my wife now is waiting for me in DC, in Washington, and we prepare to go to Moscow this Sunday, because I have a visa just for 10 days. So I need to go there. to Moscow. If you have any questions, I am ready to answer.
Hi. I have a two-part question. The first part is for Mr. Nechepurenko. Upon Oswald's alleged defection to the Soviet Union and his return to the United States, he associated in Dallas with people that were basically known enemies of the Soviet state, the white Russian exile community. Did alarm bells go off in the Soviet embassy when he entered the embassy in Mexico regarding his associations with the white Russian exile community in Dallas?
Что? Кто? Well, we never knew about his contacts, connections outside our embassy, because he was unknown. He was unknown for us when he appeared. So I cannot answer.
Were those people, though, unknown to you, though, were white Russians in Dallas? Were they known to Soviet intelligence?
During visits or after, or during my research?
Before the assassination.
No, never. We knew nothing about him. He appeared 27th of September for us as an absolutely unknown person.
Did Soviet intelligence monitor, though, anti-communist white exiles in the United States and in Mexico at that time?
Repeat, please.
Did Soviet intelligence monitor and track white Russian exiles in Dallas and in Mexico at that time?
No, we haven't.
Okay, thank you.
This is for the Colonel also. Could you tell me how three ranking KGB folks could allow, as you've just stated, a total stranger to come into your embassy, which would be then Soviet soil, brandish a pistol, put it on the table, have a nervous breakdown in front of you, and the pistol wasn't confiscated, and this man wasn't arrested? Why not?
You know that it was the first precedent for us, such situation which appeared. As in Mexico City at that time, the terrorism didn't begin. So we were quite relaxed, no?
Quite.
But at that time we haven't some such strict security means for visitors as I know now in each embassy. So when Yatskov disloaded the gun and returned it to visitor, I think it was mistake to do so. And when he prepared to leave the embassy and took the gun, Yatskov returned the bullets to him.
Gave the bullets back?
Yes, and he put in his pocket, not loaded the gun, but put in his pocket and left. I consider, I agreed with you, this question is very important, no? But I consider it was a mistake, or maybe I analyzed my own position in that situation. But I am not sure that I did some other thing, no? But now I consider it was necessary to disload the gun and call the Mexican police and give them bullets and the subject. But at that time, it's happened what happened.
But just a follow-up question. The Soviet embassy being Soviet soil, isn't it against the law for people that have guns?
But he didn't mean us to my colleagues. He just said about the persecution, about.
But isn't mere possession of a
Eh?
isn't mere possession of a firearm illegal in the Soviet Union?
He was foreigner, and
He's a foreigner on Soviet soil, though, sir. I'm sorry. Thanks.
It's very. You are right. You are right, but.
This is also for Colonel Nechiporenko. I have the distinction of living in Kansas City and having had many meetings with former FBI agent Jim Hosty. And on every occasion, and especially one when he interrupted a lecture with 300 people, he stood up and cried out, "I want your opinion." He cried out that Valery Kostikov had Oswald kill John Kennedy. Well, how do you feel about that, and what is your opinion?
Opinion of Jim Hosty.
His storyline is Kostikov had Oswald kill John Kennedy.
You know that I directed Oswald for killing John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You can see it in the book.
Pardon?
You can see in my book that I was the person who participated in the conspiracy which prepared Khrushchev, together with Semичастный and other people, to kill Kennedy, and I was the person selected to direct Oswald with the help of some mythological agent of KGB, preparing the Kennedy killing. So, such many subjects for some thrillers or some detective films or some detective movies that I think we can do a very good profits with them.
Well, actually, I think that was not an accusation, but doesn't it sound kind of in line with the disinformation and high-profile posturing to have later said they made him do it?
Well, you know that if you have book here, I can say you why I selected some epigraph of Bernard Shaw before the chapter on the visits of Lee Harvey Oswald, actual Lee Harvey, not imposter. And it was because the truth is more jokes than any jokes. So, in the first visit, Kostikov is is a base for many speculations. He was in very hurry, очень торопился, in very hurry to meet our friends to go to take some beer. It was why he called me to follow the talk with this person. And Saturday, it was a coincidence that all three of us visited the embassy at the same moment when Lee Harvey Oswald appeared there, because we came for volleyball play.
This is for Mr. Gaten Fonzie. The question is simply, it's my understanding that you believe there was a conspiracy of some sort to frame Oswald in the Silvio Odio incident and implicate him in the presidential assassination. I need that clarification, is that correct? And if that's the case, why do you think the conspirators would attempt to frame Oswald by putting him in the as a lone nut assassin and as a pro-Castro assassin by putting him in the company of two men who are anti-Castro? people. It would seem to me the more plausible frame-up would be just to have him go alone and not to pose as a anti-Castro Cuban, but to pose as a pro-Castro Cuban, if that's what they're trying to frame him as. What was their motivation for doing it in this way, if you can please explain?
To take your question from the rear end, as it were, I think it would have been much more suspicious for an American to be approaching Silvio Odio alone at night by himself and try to get her in any kind of legitimate conversation about what. But as I said before, the evidence in terms of developing Silvio Odio's credibility was that indeed it did happen, that Oswald was linked to the Kennedy assassination before the assassination. Now again, you asked the question, why did they use anti-Castro Cubans instead of pro-Castro Cubans? And I speculated before, when trying to analyze the sophisticated intelligence techniques that someone like David Atlee Phillips used, they covered the spectrum. And there was a possibility, and I still term it just a possibility and speculation again on my part, that they were trying, and while they were doing this, at the same time they were linking Oswald to the most leftist elements of the anti-Castro Cubans, because again, the bottom line on so many of these techniques is confusion. And as I say, it's just a guess on my part. But you know, as I also agreed with Bob on, the whole Odio incident may be connected to a larger incident that we know nothing about. I don't have answers, I just have speculation.
Hi, I want to just say that I think this is one of the most interesting panels I have ever attended, and I think this is really precious, and I always remember Colonel Nechepurenko shaking his head in bewilderment as Bob Dorf reels off his wonderfully researched chronology, and I think it's fabulous. It's great. I have two little questions and an important one for Gaten Fonzie and anybody else who wants to answer it. My little questions are the bent card business coming from Angleton. I'd love to know the source. The Win Scott book, I spoke to Mike Scott some months ago, and I thought there were 4 pages, and I didn't know where you got the whole book from. I'd love to know that. But here's my big question. The original FBI interview of Silvio Odio, dated December '63, which I've had for some 10 or 20 years, and I keep circulating to critics and asking for an answer, and now I'd like an answer now. She says, and this is her original story, that Mrs. Odio says that Oswald, that when he calls her up, he says that Oswald said, "You guys are crazy. I bet you guys would like to kill President Kennedy after what he did to you at the Bay of Pigs." Like Oswald scolding these two guys for behaving in this fashion. So my question is, are you aware of the original Silvio Odio FBI interview? Has Odio been questioned about this? Did she change her story? And why don't I see this discussed in anyone's books? It seems to me the original account is very important, and if there's an answer to it, I'd like to know what it is, because it's a completely different spin on Oswald. In fact, it has Oswald in the presence of people who he's irritated with because he doesn't like the fact that they're anti-Kennedy.
You have to remember, to answer that last question, when I first approached Silvio Odio, I had a heck of a time trying to get her to even talk with me. At the time, I was working for Senator Schweiker on the Senate Intelligence Committee and his subcommittee. And she had been so disillusioned by her handling by the FBI and by the Warren Commission that she didn't want anything to do with the government. She said she had read her reports. They had lied about so many things. They had misled her. I never saw anyone so disillusioned with what she had tried to say. So the credibility of those initial FBI reports, just as the other FBI reports that followed that in terms of trying to link Loran Hall and Seymour and Howard to the visit, and which the Warren Commission used as a basis, were totally later discredited. So I just don't think you can give FBI reports that stamp of official approval as far as the actual truth goes. I questioned Sylvia Odio over and over again, and she was consistent in her story as far as what Leopolda told her Oswald had said, Leon had said. And, you know, the wordings, slight wordings in terms of repetitions may not be exactly the same, but the way it appears in the House Assassination Committee report that I wrote, that volume 10, that's the way she told it. The other part of the question,
Yeah,
perhaps
yeah.
Bob Dorf could address.
Just make a note on that. As far as the Win Scott, your question about that, it was called a manuscript in the Lopez report. It's only, is it 8 pages? So maybe you gave up on it early, you know. 8 pages is not a book. But that's the way, why we use that description of it. The source for the bent card technique attributed to Angleton is Professor Scott, Peter Dale Scott. Unpublished material by his, which I have here, which I'm happy to share with you.
This question's for Mr. Fonzie. How and when were the Winfred Scott files discovered?
Again, I'll defer to Bob Dorf, who did most of the research in that area.
It's my recollection, and I'm not sure about this, that that was discovered by, that was in Angleton's, Angleton discovered that in Scott's safe after Scott died, and he removed it. And how it got into the, and was released, Mary, do you remember about, one of his son who,
I beg your pardon?
wasn't it Win Scott's son who petitioned the CIA under the Freedom of Information Act?
I think he did. Didn't he, David? Didn't Win Scott's son petition for that contents of, that's how we
Yeah.
know about it.
That's how that came out.
According to the Warren Commission, there was a man named Albert Osborne on the bus trip down to Mexico. Has anybody researched the connection between Mr. Osborne and Oswald?
I can
on
give you
time?
a shoe size. Yes, I worked for a number of years. There were 2 men who used the alias Bowen. The Albert Osborne, the old gentleman who rode the bus and a preacher in Mexico, used the name John Howard Bowen. He was actually born in England. For some reason, he took the identity of a Pennsylvania-born man who was deceased, named John Howard Bowen. Then we had a man here who worked at Jagerschild Stovall with Lee Oswald at the time they worked there. He was actually a convicted bank robber from Canada. His actual name was John Caesar Grossi, Grossi, but he went under the name of Jack Leslie Bowen. And I tried to connect them. Were they related? I don't think there's any relation to them. I think both men are very strange, and I wish we knew more about.
There were witnesses on the bus that said they spoke together and spent the whole trip together. The Warren Commission investigated Bowen. He lied consistently to them.
He did lie. He lied. He said he wasn't on the bus. One particular thing, one peculiar thing is the FBI would interview this man as Albert Osborne in Chattanooga, and he'd never heard of John Howard Bowen. And no, he was so-and-so from England. And then they had turned around and interviewed the same man over in Georgia a week later as John Howard Bowen. He never heard of Albert Osborne. It took several months for the FBI. Does somebody have a more accurate detail on, I don't have my notes right in front of me.
I just have a couple of notes on it myself, that one John Howard Bowen, who they say is Albert Osborne, in the Warren Commission, they investigated as a American Nazi before and during World War II in Tennessee.
Bud Fensterwald did a great deal of investigation during the late 60s on this man. He went to Chattanooga, Knoxville. That seemed to have been where he had most of his activities in this country. And there was evidence. There is a gentleman, a newspaper reporter, and I have his name at home, who has done a great deal of work on Albert Osborne and his connection with Nazis and extreme right-wing causes.
Are you familiar with the Torbett document and Torbett's
I'm sorry,
allegations
I
about-
don't put as much faith in the Torbett document as most people do. It may be a very valid document, but
One point that should be investigated, I don't know if it is a
well, I
fact.
knew the writer. I knew Dave Copeland when he wrote it. He was a fine lawyer and a very interesting man, but I think he just was spinning a
Well,
great
just one
tale.
point that people should be aware of, that he fingered Osborne as the contact man for an FBI assassination team stationed in Mexico. And I think
That
that's
may
a
be
key
right.
point to this whole bus trip.
It may be right. I don't know.
Mr. Fonzie, I think that perhaps you got off the hook of an earlier question a little bit too easily. If this was a sophisticated operation to paint Lee Harvey Oswald as a left-wing lunatic who was going to assassinate the President of the United States, the question is not just, number one, why would they link him with an anti-Castro group via the Odio incident? Your response there might have something to do with it being a left-wing anti-Castro group as opposed to some other anti-Castro group. But the other half of the question that wasn't asked is this. Lee Harvey Oswald and 544 Camp Street are so conspicuously intertwined that it's just totally mind-boggling that, say, Guy Bannister was the CIA contact. I mean, how on the face of the earth could they be running a sophisticated operation to prove to the world that this was a left-wing lunatic while having him running in and out of that office for weeks at a time, stamping 544 Camp Street on his literature? Put the man somewhere else. This was just insanity, and it went on for an extended period of time. It was not one visit to one woman on some unknown evening. What is the answer?
I have no idea, sir. Do you?
No, we don't have an idea.
Isn't it
As I said
central?
before-
Isn't it just such a central question?
As I said before, I was speculating in terms of the reasons for the visit to Odio. The 544 Camp Street address was stamped on the pamphlets, as you know, but the comings and goings of Oswald there wasn't publicly known. It wasn't directed as something that was meant to come out, as it seemed the Odio incident was in the 544 Camp
But there would
Street.
have been
So
no
we're
need.
in
But there would have been no. There would have been no concern about it coming out if he were simply placed somewhere else. I mean, who was running whom?
I mean, if we had the answers, we'd know a hell of a lot.
That's exactly why I'm asking the questions.
I think that there is another answer to your question.
Go ahead.
A simple one. It worked.
Well, I don't know. It didn't work. I mean, you know.
No.
It didn't
Were you, I don't know how old you were, and I'm not inquiring about your age, but I can tell you that in the weeks and months following the Kennedy assassination, the framing of Lee Harvey Oswald worked like a charm.
But I mean, this made no sense as part of any plan to frame him as a left-winger. I mean, why do it that way?
We need to kind of wrap this question up to give time for somebody else.
Fine.
While the next person's coming in, we pause just for a minute. We need to let the gentlemen that are videotaping this change their